All right, diving right in today. This time we're looking at some CIA documents, all having to do with the JFK Assassination Records Act.
Okay.
From 1992 specifically.
Right.
And I guess the main focus is Lee Harvey Oswald and his time in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
But also we're going to look at a lot of related stuff having to do with Soviet citizens marrying foreigners. So
this is interesting.
Yeah, so like the mission today is really just to understand how interested the CIA was in Oswald when he was in the USSR.
Right.
And what specific methods they used in the Cold War to investigate these marriages.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what's fascinating about these documents is you get like this really granular look at how the CIA operated during the Cold War.
Yeah.
And so it's, it's not just like the big picture stuff. You're really getting down into the nitty gritty of like individual cases.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And they're trying to like understand patterns, Yeah.
And this particular pattern, with the movement of people across the Iron Curtain.
Yeah.
And especially with someone like Oswald.
Yeah.
Whose actions, as we know, became so historically significant later.
Okay, so the first document is a memo dated June 1st, 1964.
Okay.
And it's an interview with a Mr. Frank Freiberg.
Okay.
And it seems to revolve around Warren Commission inquiries regarding Oswald's stop in Finland in October 1959, right before he entered the Soviet Union.
Right.
So what jumps out at you from this interview?
Well, what's really striking is how granular the Warren Commission's inquiry was. I mean, they were focused on what seemed like really minor logistical details.
Okay.
Like, the drive from the Helsinki airport to downtown is like 25 minutes, right?
Right.
The Soviet consulate is a 5-minute taxi ride from there.
Yeah.
And so they're really like trying to reconstruct Oswald's movements.
And timeline down to the minute. And it really hints at their suspicion that even a brief stopover could have been significant.
Right.
Perhaps for meeting with Soviet officials or something.
Right. And then they even mentioned that the Soviet consulate probably closed early on Saturdays.
Right.
In 1959.
Yeah.
Around 1:000 p.m. local time. Which again,
to be significant.
Yeah, it's like this tiny detail.
Yeah.
That could, make or break some theory.
Totally.
About what he was doing.
Totally. Like if he arrived late on Saturday, then that changes the whole thing, in terms of who he could have contacted, when, and all that.
Yeah.
And then also, Freiberg mentions that the U.S. consulate in Helsinki only kept passenger lists and manifests for like 6 months before destroying them.
Wow.
Which is pretty wild.
Yeah.
And that just, that really kind of illustrates the challenges.
That the investigators faced in trying to like reconstruct these past events, especially because, these are records that weren't meant to be kept forever.
Right.
And then there's also the mention of Mr. Robert Fulton, who was a CIA consular official stationed there at the time.
Yeah.
So again, just subtly reminding us of the CIA's presence, even in what might seem like just routine diplomatic function.
Right.
But
it's also interesting that Freiberg agreed it would be worthwhile to cable the station concerning points not covered by the State Department's inquiry.
Right. Yeah. It seems like the CIA is doing their own independent information gathering here.
Yeah.
And they want to make sure that all the angles are explored, even beyond the official channels.
Right.
So, I mean, that's really at the heart of what the CIA does.
Yeah.
They're often looking for information.
Yeah.
That might be missed.
Right.
By traditional means.
Right. Okay, so the next document is a memo of a discussion that happened on July 9, 1964.
Okay.
With Mr. W. David Slauson, who's a staff member of the Warren Commission. And it seems like the CIA was addressing some inconsistencies in the material that had been provided to the commission from both the CIA and the Department of State.
Okay.
So what was Slauson's main concern here?
Well, he was really focused on whether or not Oswald's departure from the USSR was unusual.
Okay.
And he specifically cited potential Soviet relaxation and emigration policies during the post-Stalin era.
Right.
And his questions really center around three things.
Okay.
did Soviet authorities generally permit Soviet citizens to marry foreigners and then emigrate?
Right. Were Soviet spouses allowed to leave with their husbands?
Okay.
And then how long did it usually take Soviet citizens to get exit visas?
Right.
So he's really trying to establish, what are the norms around Soviet immigration in cases of marriage to foreigners?
Okay, so he's basically trying to understand the standard procedures and timelines.
Right.
So he could see if Marina Oswald's departure with Oswald fit into those parameters.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that leads us to the next part.
Yeah.
Which is this CIA analysis of 26 cases of Soviets married to foreigners.
Okay.
So what does this internal review tell us about Slosson's concerns?
So this analysis is really interesting because it moves beyond just policy and actually looks at historical cases, right? So they're looking at these 26 instances to see if they can find similarities to the Oswald situation. But they note right away that there is a key difference.
Okay.
The majority of these cases involved foreign students, exchange teachers, and other individuals who only had short stays in the USSR.
Yeah.
Which isn't really like Oswald, who was there for much longer and even had a job.
Yeah. So out of these 26 cases, how many of the Soviet wives actually left with their husband?
Right. So the data showed that only 4 out of 26 Soviet wives actually departed the USSR with their husbands.
Yeah.
In 14 cases, the foreign spouse left alone.
Okay.
And then the remaining 7, they didn't have enough info.
Wow.
Which suggests that it wasn't a routine occurrence at all.
So already that makes you wonder about Marina Oswald.
Exactly.
And how easily she was able to leave.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Yeah.
So the memo also says that the State Department gave data on 724 immigrant visas issued by the American Embassy in Moscow.
Oh, yeah.
And this was between 1954 and 63.
Right.
But they didn't actually say how many of those visas were for Soviets who had married U.S. nationals.
Yeah.
Which seems like a pretty big...
Yeah, it's a pretty big omission.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're trying to understand how common it was, it's like you're missing a big piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so the memo does note that the info from the State Department pretty much lined up with an earlier CIA memo.
Right.
So
it seems like they're in agreement about the overall situation.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's also worth pointing out that Mr. Slosson said he would be sending parts of his report to the CIA to check specifically the parts dealing with Soviet intelligence services.
Mm-hmm. It shows how much the Warren Commission relied on the CIA's expertise.
Yeah. Especially when it came to Soviet stuff.
Right.
And, the CIA knew a lot about Soviet intelligence operations and personnel.
Right.
So it makes sense that the commission would rely on them.
Yeah.
And then we also see that a CIA officer named Wigrin actually reviewed Marina Oswald's re-interview testimony.
Okay.
Which was in volume 22 of the Warren Commission transcripts.
Okay.
So, again, showing how involved the agency was in her case.
Okay, so let's dive into the specifics of those 26 cases.
Okay.
So we have instances where the foreigner left without their Soviet spouse, and instances where the spouse did accompany them.
Yeah.
Were there any cases that stuck out to you?
Yeah, there were a few that were really interesting.
Okay.
So, for example, there's the case of Sternzaslavsky Arlene.
Okay.
And it specifically mentions that the wife actually succeeded in getting her Soviet husband out. Okay.
Of the USSR.
Yeah.
And that seems to be an exception to the general pattern.
Right.
So it makes you wonder,
yeah.
What were the circumstances there?
Right.
And then there's the case of Kirsch Leonard, where this Soviet wife arrived in the USA by February 1962.
Okay.
So that's another successful emigration.
Right.
But we don't know the specifics of how long it took or anything like that.
Right.
So
it's,
it's just interesting to see these variations.
Right. Okay, so the documents also mention whether or not the Soviet spouse was granted a visa.
Right.
And how long that took.
Yeah.
And there's this distinction between implieds and knowns.
Right. Yeah. What's that about?
Yeah, what is that about? So it seems like they're differentiating between cases where the documents specifically say whether a visa was granted.
Right.
And then cases where they infer,
that a visa must have been issued because the spouse eventually shows up in the West.
Right.
But they don't actually have the documentation in the files.
Yeah.
So, it's a subtle distinction.
Yeah.
But it does tell us something.
Right.
About the completeness of their information.
Okay, so then let's look at the time lapse.
Yeah.
Between the application and the issuance of the exit visa. What were the typical durations?
Right. So it seems like there's a lot of variability.
Okay.
Which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Soviet bureaucracy.
Yeah.
So there are 3 cases.
Okay.
With delays of several months.
Right.
So one is 5 months, one is 6, and one is 9 months.
Wow.
And then there's this one case that's really interesting.
Okay.
Where the authorities told a husband that his wife's application couldn't even be processed until he had left the USSR.
And then her visa was issued like 6 weeks after he left.
Wow.
Yeah.
So they're making him leave first.
Yeah, it seems like a deliberate tactic to make sure he's gone.
Right.
Yeah. And then in several other cases, they were able to kind of estimate the time frames.
Yeah.
So we have one case of 4 to 5 months.
Okay.
6 to 7 months.
Yeah.
9 months, and then 11 months.
Right.
And then we have 3 other cases.
Okay.
Where it took at least 7, 11, and 12 months.
Wow.
So,
So it seems like
it's all over the place.
Yeah, it's a long and unpredictable process.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting
to
compare to Marina Oswald's case, you
know? Yeah.
Assuming that they actually had that information, readily available.
Yeah.
But the inconsistency shows that it wasn't a standardized process.
Right.
And individual factors likely played a role.
Right.
In how long it took.
Okay, we also have this section of miscellaneous notes about other aspects of these cases.
Yeah.
So Arlene Zaslavsky hired Harold Berman.
Oh, right.
Who was an expert in Soviet law to advocate for her husband. So
it shows you just how complicated these things could be.
Yeah, right.
They needed legal help to navigate this system.
Okay, then there's this note about Joseph C. Fondam.
Okay.
Who was from the former British Cameroons.
Right.
And he was married to a Soviet woman.
Okay.
And he said that she was ostracized.
Oh, wow.
By her family and friends.
Yeah.
And they had to scrounge for housing.
Wow.
They could only find like illegal overpriced stuff.
Wow.
For 30 or 40 rubles a month. And the U.S. Embassy actually called him questionable.
Oh, really? So that shows you the challenges that these couples faced in the Soviet Union socially.
Yeah.
And, this questionable label really reflects the Cold War mentality.
Right.
They're seeing these relationships as potential security risks,
Right. Right. And then Edgar Lehman was a U.S. exchange professor at Moscow University.
Right.
And he married a Soviet woman. And apparently, Moscow officials asked for proofs of sanity.
Proofs of sanity? Yeah.
From the marriage bureau.
Wow.
And Lehman wouldn't even confirm this story.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's wild.
Yeah.
It's like, it really shows how the Soviet authorities interfered in people's personal lives.
Yeah.
Especially when it involved foreigners.
Right.
And the fact that he wouldn't confirm the story.
Just shows how sensitive it was.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's Tamara, who insisted on having both a church wedding and a civil registration.
Right.
And this made the CIA suspect Soviet intelligence involvement.
Really?
Yeah.
Just because of that?
Yeah.
Huh.
So
interesting.
Yeah, it really shows how they saw these relationships through this lens of security concerns.
Right. Yeah. Like everything's suspicious.
Yeah.
During the Cold War.
Okay. We also have this list of Soviet women who married people from other countries.
Okay.
And it gives their names, their spouses' nationalities, and whether they left the USSR.
Okay.
So, for example, Natalia Borisova married an Italian and left.
Right.
And Alida Borisovna Limbridi married a Greek national in 1959.
Okay.
So
even though it's brief,
yeah,
it still shows what the CIA was tracking.
Right.
They're trying to understand who's leaving,
right,
under what circumstances, and with whom.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, now there's this investigation in September 1964 into Joachim Josten, who was a German-born author.
Okay.
Why was the CIA interested in him?
Well, it seems like the main reason was that he wrote a book called Oswald, Assassin or Fall Guy.
Right.
So, right after the assassination, anyone writing about Oswald, especially if they're offering a different perspective than the official one, would have drawn attention.
Right. And they really dug into his background.
They did.
So they found Gestapo documents that suggested he joined the German Communist Party back in 1932.
Okay.
And that he'd lived in the USSR in 32 and 33. Right. They also noted that he used multiple pseudonyms, so they're really going deep here.
Yeah, it's really thorough.
Yeah.
I mean, they're looking at everything. Yeah. Political affiliations, time in the Soviet Union, fake names. Right. Anything that could be relevant. Yeah. And his travels through Europe in the 30s. Yeah. And then arriving in the U.S. via the USSR in 41. Right. That just adds another layer of complexity,
Okay. Yeah. So they wanted a full check on Joe Stouston and his fiancée, including pre-World War II references, and a check of BDC records.
Right, which I'm assuming is Berlin Document Center.
Right. So they were really...
Yeah, they're trying to get the full picture.
Yeah. Okay, then in February 1966... They requested a check on Roman Fedorovich Dedkov. And his wife. Yeah. And they had applied for visas to India sometime before April 1962.
Okay. And Dedkov was supposed to go to New Delhi, be an English teacher at the Soviet embassy.
Okay.
So what's the significance of this?
Well, it seems like the CIA was still interested in people with links to the Soviet Union, even after the Warren Commission stuff. Right. And Dedkov's position at the embassy would have made him someone they'd want to keep an eye on. Right. And then there's this note that says it's a zone list but not classified. Right. So that gives us some context about how they filed this information. Right.
Okay, then in February 1965... There's this dispatch sent out to all CIA stations and bases about Warren Commission testimony. Right. And it highlights the challenge of protecting the president. Right. And it urges agencies to support the Secret Service, especially when the president travels abroad. So this really shows how the assassination impacted presidential security. Right. Wow. And they recognize the importance of intelligence gathering in preventing these kinds of things from happening again.
Yeah. They also mentioned that there are excerpts of testimony that were attached. Yeah. And that these were considered to be sidelined. Yeah. And they were recommending that all senior officers read them.
Okay.
So there's some important stuff in those excerpts.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, and finally, we have this document from November 1974 about the 201 system. Right. What was that?
So the 201 system was a way for the CIA's Operations Directorate to identify, control, and file information on people who were of interest to them.
Right. So it's like a huge record-keeping system.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So you have a 201 number, which is like a unique ID for each person. Right. And then a 201 dossier, which is their file. Right. And that file has all sorts of information, like biographical data, personal history, security clearances, name check replies, even newspaper clippings.
Wow.
So
it's very
it's really thorough. Yeah. And the decision to open a 201 dossier was made by an operational component. Right. So that means they've decided this person's important. We need to collect intelligence on them. Right. And you can see from the documents that they really did gather a lot of information. Yeah.
And then they outline the steps for purging a dossier. Right. And they mentioned black tape dossiers, which were handled as restricted. Right. So